Welcome you all here tonight. And this meeting is being recorded. So happy to have everyone here for this Green Convene of 2021, where we're going to be hearing from the National Renewable Energy Lab. So go to the next slide and we'll look at what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk just for a couple of minutes about why we're talking about this. I'm going to introduce you to someone new to Metro, our new energy manager, and then we're going to hear from members of the National Renewable Energy Lab that we are partnering with, and we'll follow that with a Q&A. And as Julia said, you're welcome to put your questions in the chat box as we go, or you can save those till the end. Next slide. So I'm very proud to be a member of the Louisville Sustainability Council and to be Metro's representative on the board of directors. We work to connect communities, convene strategically, and create programs and resources for a sustainable and equitable future. We've had some great programs recently, like the micro grant program that Julia mentioned, and we're really happy to be able to convene people around different topics like we are tonight. Thank you. So when we discussed what the topic for this Green Convene would be, I posited that we should hear from NREL. So most of you on this call probably know that in February of 2020, Metro Council passed the 100% renewable energy resolution, which has 3 goals. 100% clean electricity for Louisville Metro government operations by 2030. 100% clean energy for Louisville Metro government operations by 2035, and 100% clean energy community-wide by 2040. Now, these are very ambitious goals, and those of us working in sustainability, we're thrilled to see those passed. Now, the question is, how do we get there? This is tricky for a lot of cities. Don't have a lot of expertise in this like ourselves. So we have formed a partnership with the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is run by the Department of Energy, to help us chart a path to meet that first 2030 goal, which is 100% clean electricity for Louisville Metro government operations by 2030. Kind of the first step that we took towards meeting that goal was to hire Louisville's first full-time energy manager. This is the first time someone has held that position full-time and has really been able to dive into energy use in Louisville Metro facilities. We hired Zach Tyler in February of this year, and I'd love to give him a chance to introduce himself briefly.
Thank you, Allison. Hey everyone, I'm Zach Tyler. I'm the energy manager for Louisville Metro government as of February of this year. Just to give a little bit of background, before coming to Louisville Metro, I worked as an energy services consultant for a number of years and spent most of the last 5 years implementing an energy conservation program at the University of Kentucky. And there we were able to see substantial campus-wide reductions in energy usage and costs. So currently, I am very thrilled to have joined Louisville Metro to help meet some of these ambitious sustainability goals that Council committed to last year. Since starting, I'd say initial priorities have been very much focused in a couple of areas. The first being implementing a more robust utility data benchmarking and management system so that we can quantify exactly how much renewable energy we will need to meet these sustainability goals and help inform the best pathways to get there. And that data will also be critical in working toward my second goal, which Allison mentioned, which is improving how we operate our facilities and lowering the amount of energy that Louisville Metro government ultimately consumes. So in addition to the immediate sustainability impacts and cost savings, this will ultimately make the 2030 goal a lot easier to meet and may help finance some of those long-term efforts. So I've been very excited to work with NREL and the Office of Advanced Planning and Sustainability to tackle these goals and make sure we have the right data to plan our path forward.
Thank you, Zach. We really appreciate you being here tonight. And Zach has made huge headway in looking at our energy bills and figuring out where we can reduce consumption. That really is the first step, as our presenters will briefly talk about. Reducing energy use means you have to buy less renewables. So Zach has been a huge help in that. So I'm going to change roles. I am also the Assistant Director of the Office of Advanced Planning and Sustainability for Louisville Metro Government, and I oversee all of our climate change and sustainability initiatives. So it is my pleasure to introduce our partners from the National Renewable Energy Lab, who are going to be helping my office and SAC and the rest of Metro Government reach those ambitious goals that have been set. We're going to hear from Scott Haase, who's the Director of Federal, State, and Local Strategic Partnerships for NREL. And then we'll hear from Owen Zinaman, who we've been working with closely, who's the Senior Policy and Market Analyst for Grid Planning and the Analysis Center at NREL. So thank you both for being here. We appreciate it very much, and I'll turn it over to Scott.
Thank you, Allison, for that introduction, and good to see you again. Hopefully we'll be able to meet in person soon without standing outside in the cold like we did a few months ago, whenever that was. So my name is Scott Haase. I lead our strategic partnership work with state and local jurisdictions across the country. So I'll talk a little bit about NREL itself, some of the work that we do, and then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about a recent study that we just completed for the city of Los Angeles, detailing how they might get to 100% renewables. Because this is a kind of a flagship study that the lab has completed, and it's got a lot of lessons and implications for cities across the country and frankly across the world. So go ahead, Owen. So for those who don't know, NREL is one of 17 national laboratories within the Department of Energy system. NREL, we're located in Golden, Colorado, though we do have offices in Washington, D.C., and then we do have remote staff scattered throughout the country. We are the only one that focuses 100% on energy issues, so renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy system integration, and other labs work in that space, but we are the only ones that's 100% dedicated to that, and that's in our mission and kind of in our blood. You take the next one. So a little slow transition there. So NREL, this is just a screenshot of our Golden campus. If folks are traveling through Colorado, drop Owen or myself a line, and perhaps we can meet. And if we're ever able to get back on campus, which should be this summer, we'd be happy to host and give you a tour. We have about 2,700 employees. Our facilities are kind of world-class in terms of technology, and we span the gamut from kind of basic R&D on new technologies, so new solar cells, new wind turbine manufacturing techniques, battery technologies, all the way up to applied R&D to actually look at how do we get technologies that are currently commercial adopted out into the field. And that's really where the partnership with Louisville is focused on. So let's go ahead. So over the decades, NREL has worked through a number of programs with thousands of communities across the country. And you can just see these, the blue ones are kind of some active partnerships that we've got right now, where we've learned over the years kind of what the needs are of local communities, but then also taking the capabilities, tools, and resources that have been developed through decades of funding from the U.S. Department of Energy and applying those to help communities meet their goals and objectives. You can go to the next, Owen. So really what we're focused on here with this new transition is how we help communities transition, move towards a more sustainable infrastructure. And then we would do that. Go ahead to the next one, Owen. You probably flip through these a little quickly. I think there's one more here in this section. So what we really try to do is understand the goals and plans that communities are working on and how you then actually transition those goals, typically set by city council or other folks, and then actually work towards implementation plans to move forward. So we spend a lot of time trying to understand the data, the background, and the tools that are applicable to help local jurisdictions make those decisions for themselves. You can go to the next. So I'll just spend a few minutes here talking about the LA 100 study for folks. So you can go ahead. So I think probably similar to Louisville, about, I think it was 2016, the LA City Council passed a motion directing their utility. Now there is one difference. LA Department of Water and Power is a municipally owned utility, but they directed them to explore how can they become 100% renewable. What would it take to do it? What are the costs to do that? What are the potential benefits in terms of air quality, local jobs, and how can you prioritize impacts or changes to help prioritize environmental justice communities that they benefit from these changes? And it's not just the wealthy parts of LA that make this transition. So the City Council passed this motion. We then were approached by the utility as well as the city, very much similar to yourself, to help them understand how can we get there and what are the things that we can do to achieve this. So go ahead, Owen. We completed the study in March of this year. If you want to dive into the full study, it's a very voluminous work, la100study.com. There's a lot of detailed reports. There's an executive summary. You can download the data. There's data viewers. This was a very integrated study that really we had never undertaken before at the lab. I'll talk about that in a minute, but it really integrated everything from the load side all the way up to the system planning and reliability side to really look at how Los Angeles could achieve this goal of becoming 100% renewable all the time. And actually what they wanted to do is try to figure out, could you deliver every electron as a green electron? So you can go ahead, Owen. So just a little context, LA essentially operates as an island within the larger California and Western interconnection system. They are their own balancing authority area. It's the largest municipal utility in the country, if not the world. About 4 million residents and a peak load of 6,500 megawatts, which actually I think last summer, this might be an outdated chart. It looks like I think they hit it last summer. They hit a higher peak actually in September. And I know with all of the heat waves going on across the West right now, I wouldn't be surprised if they hit another one this year. So LA has got some unique resources where they are able to bring in power from outside of their area. So very much like, say, Louisville situation where perhaps you can look at larger grid opportunities or potentially bringing in resources from some of the ISOs in that area. So we are looking at the larger holistic picture, just both within the city of Los Angeles, but then outside what those resources could be to bring to bear. You can go ahead, Owen. One thing I want to stress the importance on was we set up from the very beginning an advisory group, which was made up of community members like yourselves on this call. This 3-year study, we met with the advisory group quarterly. When we could meet in person, we did that in person in Los Angeles, where we'd have day-long meetings to go over the models, the data that we would need, the directions of the study. It was a huge, important part of the effort. So I'm glad to see that a group in Louisville is doing the same thing, or at least you're providing input and doing that. And it was a very diverse group. So it was everything from the environmental groups, local neighborhood councils, all the way up to some of the large industrial customers who were maybe a little tenuous about what these changes might mean in terms of rate and cost of electricity. But overall, it was a great group and they really made the study better. Go ahead, Owen. So I'm not going to go through the detailed study results because it's very dense, right? And I think at 6 o'clock in the evening, probably on Eastern time, even for 4 o'clock. But I'll just talk about some of the highlights and things that we looked at. So we really started initially with the load. So what would building energy usage be in Los Angeles as it evolves over time? And how could that look if you began to deploy a lot of solar across the system? So what would local solar be able to contribute to the overall 100% goal of meeting LA's targets? You can go to the next, Owen. And we also looked then at bulk system and trying to compare, okay, what are the trade-offs between a high distributed scenario and a high bulk system scenario? So building more wind turbines, solar plants out in the desert and bringing that power in. Go ahead. And then another part of it was really making sure that the system that was designed for the future would be reliable and could meet all of the kind of safety standards, but also deliverability and high reliability factors that the city maintains for keeping the lights on. So just an example of the wildfire issues in the West. But wherever you are, you need to make sure that whatever you're doing still keeps power flowing. You can go to the next. We looked at the jobs. So how many local jobs would be created through this transition? We know that jobs will change with natural gas plants shut down, if there's more solar installers, battery installers, EV station maintainers or installers. So we wanted to look at what those changes might be. So we tabulated all of that. And go ahead. And then we looked at the health benefits and impacts as well from changing air quality. So especially through electrification of transportation was the biggest contributor. If you're able to electrify a lot of the cars, buses, and trucks, you improve air quality. And this significantly impacted disadvantaged communities more than other communities. So we did go in and monetize the health benefits from this change. You can go to the next. And then the ultimate question they asked is, what would this cost? So we looked at several different scenarios, and the question was, how much will it cost to build a system that 15 to 25 years from now can deliver 100% renewable energy? So we quantified that and then looked at the impacts on utility rates as well, which is kind of part of the study that's going on right now. You can go to the next one. So I'll just go over high level a couple of the scenarios. Go ahead. Because I think this is important for Louisville to understand kind of how you begin to get there. Because some underlying assumptions is that we looked at different levels of electrification across the system. So there were goals in Los Angeles to, one, electrify most of the transportation fleet, but also a lot of the building end uses. So think of things like cooking, heating, cooling. So moving those towards more electrical and getting away from natural gas. So we had moderate levels of electrification, high levels, and then stress, which would be achieving that high level without the energy efficiency side of things. And that definitely added to the cost. And you can put the next up there, Owen. We had 4 scenarios that we looked at, and these were kind of different pathways, if you will. The SB 100 was just basically state policy, that if we were to follow state policy to achieve 100% by 2045, this is the things you could do. It did allow, as the state does allow, up to 10% of the target could be offset by natural gas and then trading renewable electricity credits online, or however you can procure those to help meet that offset. And it did allow existing nuclear to stay in the picture. Contrast that to the upper right, the early and no biofuels option. This was one of the items requested from the advisory group, that they wanted to say, okay, is there a scenario that we can get there, not by 2045, but let's say 10 years earlier, 2035, and we don't want any biofuels in the mix. So basically no emissions whatsoever. So that took out things like renewable diesel, biogas, landfill gas, all of those types of fuels. And that made it pretty difficult to achieve, and it did increase the costs. And then we had a transmission focus, which was basically looking at larger bulk systems delivering bulk power into LA. And then the limited new transmission was essentially trying to do as much as you could through local solar. So building distributed solar across the city and open land across rooftops, trying to understand what the trade-offs were between large bulk and more distributed futures. Go ahead, Owen. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is kind of the modeling chart that we used, where we took everything that we had previously used at the lab across the sectors and stitched all these models together in a way that had never been done. So starting on the left, looking at the building loads, commercial, residential, industrial, large commercial, like the airport, the port, and then the transportation loads, identifying what those were now, but then trying to understand how they would evolve over the time, doing bottoms up load modeling. We developed basically representation for the entire city and ran these through our high performance computer to really understand how load would evolve, especially in a warmer climate. So 20 years from now, we know that the temperature is going to be warmer. So what's that going to do to things like air conditioning? We looked at distributed generation adoption, bulk system adoption, energy efficiency, and then the production cost modeling to understand what the cost of these future systems would be as you begin to dispatch this system. And then a lot of power flow studies to make sure that it would actually, and I see a question there, I'll answer that in a question. So trying to make sure that the system that's built actually operates in a reliable manner and does not exceed power outage limits set by the utility. And then all of that flowed into the economic impact and the environmental analysis. So the output of these models, there were multiple outputs that came together, one fitting into the other. But what was determined were the pathways essentially to get to this 100% target, and what the different trade-offs were for those 4 scenarios that I mentioned earlier. So go ahead to the next one, Owen. Oh, and yeah, the data required, we just thought this was kind of an interesting slide, that the amount of data required to do this project was significant. You know, you could see the stack there of CDs, what it would be, but 50 terabytes, really without having access to a high performance computer to do these simulations, would not be possible to do this type of analysis. And we are trying to build off this to look at how we can transfer what we did to other cities, other jurisdictions. And that's why we're so pleased with the partnership we have with Louisville right now to really understand how we can take what we've done and scale it to different sized communities across the US in different areas and in different political climates or regulatory environments as well. Go ahead, Owen. Just got a couple more here. So anyway, in all scenarios, basically we found that between 70 to close to 90% of electricity demand could be met by wind and solar with some storage in there. But go to the next slide. It's really that last 10% is where you diverge from trying to understand how you get to that 100%. So there are some open questions. Is 90% good enough? And maybe you do the rest from offsets. But we did want to figure out, okay, how do we truly get to 100% renewables? So some very interesting things began to emerge from the study. For those cloudy days, the times where it's nighttime and you can't be producing solar and wind. Go ahead, Owen. And so you can go ahead to the next one. Also the unplanned events, transmission outages. So really what we found is you needed some type of long duration storage and able to do this, and some firm generating capacity as well to meet kind of peaker plant issues going forward. Right now, utilities typically use natural gas to meet this. Given the study that we couldn't use natural gas except for that one scenario, the SB 100, we had to find some other type of fuel. So we really focused in on hydrogen, the potential to store hydrogen, potentially manufacture hydrogen in LA, and then dispatch those either through fuel cells or through new hydrogen combustion turbine, and potentially even modifying natural gas plants to run on hydrogen. We also looked at liquid biofuels and gaseous biofuels in the scenarios that allowed those. So some of the next priorities for LA are to try to understand, okay, what is the role for hydrogen? Can we do some hydrogen demonstration projects? They have a very large coal plant right now located in Utah that is on pathway to transition to natural gas. And then they want to burn 30% hydrogen in with that natural gas by 2025. So we're actually working with them to try to understand, where do you produce this hydrogen from? Where do you store it? And then what are the trade-offs of using renewables to produce that hydrogen? You can go to the next one. So anyway, what we found was that we could reach 100%, and that the systems that could be built would meet all the traditional reliability factors that utilities want to have, or at least that LA wants to have. But it would also provide significant other benefits in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, air quality improvements, and public health. So you can just skip to the next one, Owen. So one finding from this, just in 2045 alone, reductions in fine particulate matter, things like asthma and increased life expectancy, health impacts, 1.5 billion in public health savings just in 2045 alone would accrue from this transition. You can go to the next. And kind of the overall package of higher efficiency, increased electrification, flexibility within your demand. So kind of tying the time that you're using your electricity to when you've got cheaper resources on the system. Say there's a bunch of solar on the system, you would time your charging of electric vehicles at that time. That overall kind of that package system reduced the costs of electricity, but also increased the benefits compared to other options that we looked at. You can go to the next.
Scott, one quick question from the chat. In the scenario where you looked at nuclear, did you look at third and fourth generation nuclear or the traditional?
Yeah, so right now what we looked at was just their existing shares of the Palo Verde nuclear plant, which are, I think, scheduled through the 2030s, mid-2030 timeframe. So we made a conscious decision at the beginning of the project to kind of look at, because of their goal, it was trying to get to 100% renewable. Nuclear from the advisory group was deemed, not to meet in there, though they did kind of make the compromise that, okay, we have this existing contract with Palo Verde, so let's keep that in the mix, recognizing that it is a carbon-free resource. I know that there are other communities. We're doing some work in the Carolinas with Duke Energy right now, and they are very much looking at those small modular reactors and kind of those advanced nuclear technologies to potentially meet their 100% carbon reduction goals at the utility scale. So then I think I'm close to the end of the slides here, but we also did a very detailed kind of economic analysis to go look at those job impacts. And what we found is that there would be thousands of new jobs created, and then overall the investments required by the utility would not be a significant impact on the economy of Los Angeles. That it could be done in a reasonable manner. Certainly financing these large investments is something that you need to consider carefully as the utility would go through and do that. Also being a utility, they can enter into power purchase contracts, they can build their own systems, or they can work with their customers to deploy these out on the roof. So there's ways to kind of share the cost. And go ahead, Owen. We just are working now on a second phase of the study that is really focused on the equity and the environmental justice side of things. So when the LA 100 study came out, we recognized that significant amount of work needed to be done to ensure that as LA moves forward implementing this, that they do reach all communities. So phase 2 of the project is actually going to be another 2-year detailed study going out and working with folks in local communities to really understand, okay, what are your priorities? What are your needs? How do you see, say, trade-offs between more energy efficiency or rooftop solar or electric vehicle charging stations built in different neighborhoods, and really trying to gather input and then work with the utility and the city on program design. So this work should actually be starting next week. We're very excited about this because it is kind of a next step in this transition process to make sure that it is equitable. And then go ahead. I think this is the last slide. So I guess kind of the transition between what I was talking about and then what Owen will talk about is that within the lab and DOE, we kind of recognize that this pioneering study of Los Angeles, this 3-year effort, that new capabilities and understandings have been developed. So we're really trying to look at, okay, how do we take what we did here and then export this to other communities across the US and really work with those local jurisdictions to kind of hone this in and customize it for those local needs. We know not every city is similar to Los Angeles at all. As I said earlier, there's very different local situations. You may not need the entire whole study. So Louisville, for example, focused on metro electricity operations. At this time, not looking community-wide. So all of these approaches, I think, will help influence how we work with you all, as well as input from the community and the city. So it's exciting. Stay tuned. I think in the next couple of years, you'll see more and more of this rolling out, and we look forward to the partnership. So I think that's the last of my slides, or yeah, the talk that I was going to do.
Scott, there's a question for you in the chat asking what % did energy conservation and efficiency play in LA?
I wonder if I could pull up one of those slides. I don't know off the top of my head what the percentage was, though I do know that the load, whatever we projected out the different loads through those scenarios. So certainly the ones that had high demand response and energy efficiency had the lowest projected future loads. So we're looking at it, the percentage that was met is not quite the right way to do it, because if you didn't have that, then the amount of renewables you would have to supply was larger. I would say probably, I'm trying to remember the one chart, probably on the order of another 1,000 megawatts or so needed to achieve that. Maybe while Owen's going, talking through his slides, I could pull up that one from my other decks.
I would also just say generally that there is this natural tension between energy conservation and efficiency, and then electrification, right? So if we're transitioning everything over in the transport sector into the electricity sector, or we're electrifying our heating, space and water heating, things like that, you're going to have pressure on load to go up. So the question is, when you do that electrification, is it efficient or not? So it's kind of a multi-dimensional question, at least the answer is, but it's a great question. And maybe Scott, you can pull some things up in the interim. We should have some time at the end to circle back to that. So I think with that, if it's okay, I'll kind of get going here and start my my presentation. There are also, Scott, just have a look in the chat. Another question just came up about electricity coming in from the Pacific Northwest, and maybe you can address that in the Q&A at the end as well. So, let me kind of get started here. So my name is Owen Zinaman. I've been at NREL for about 10 years. I'm the program manager and also the technical lead for the partnership between NREL and the Louisville Metro government. Let me talk a little bit about what exactly NREL will be doing with the city, just to get you all up to speed. So first and foremost, Allison mentioned this already, NREL is being asked to focus initially on Metro government's 2030 goal. And that goal, again, it's 100% clean electricity for Metro government operations, by 2030. This is about the facilities, the buildings that Metro government operates that use electricity, and then cleaning up that electricity supply, as opposed to maybe a goal for the entire community or a goal having to do with addressing natural gas in buildings or transportation fleet, things like that. So for the first phase of the activity, which we're currently in, this is a small contract just to get us started. And NREL is identifying at a high level just the various avenues and measures and pathways that the city has available to meet that 2030 goal. So, to date, I've had a look at your legal and institutional context, the city's relationship with LG&E, a few other dimensions. And today I'm going to present some, very initial high-level results, and I'm looking forward to doing that. But I should say beyond that, the other major activity in phase one is to draft a statement of work for a much bigger and broader phase two. And in that phase two, we are actually going to be evaluating the portfolio of options to achieve that 2030 goal in a much more detailed way. Let me head to the next slide.
Oh, and real quick, I just
Yeah,
want to
go ahead.
mention, sure. I just want to mention that while NREL is focused on the 2030 goal, I don't want to give the impression that Metro government is ignoring the others. So most of you probably know the mayor issued an executive order on electric vehicles. We are already looking at that 2040 goal. I'm sorry, 2035 goal for clean energy for government operations. And as we think about energy efficiency grants, we think about how we can help the community at large reach that 2040 goal. We are working toward those, but we are utilizing NREL just for the 2030 goal. There was a budget request for phase 2, and we are committed to pursuing phase 2 once we wrap up phase 1. So I'll turn it back over to Owen.
Great, thanks for that. And yeah, there was a really great question in the chat about the potential for solar installations on municipal government buildings. And I think that's something that I can talk a little bit more about a little later in the presentation. And if I forget to talk about it, please, ping me again or just speak up, and I'll make sure to chat with you about that. This slide quickly, I bring this up just to say, we are starting this process by really focusing on the first 2 items here. So identifying what options that the city has available to achieve its 2030 goal, and then evaluating the technical and economic merits of those options. So, however, I should say, when we work with cities, we also very regularly provide advice on how to prioritize different actions. And then we definitely can also help to plan and implement individual programs and policies to help achieve the city goal. So we kind of really do the full life cycle, the full spectrum. So, as you're probably already putting together, the city and Allison and her team in particular, they've enrolled us as a partner to just ensure that the city pursues the most viable and economic, logical, equitable path to achieving the 2030 goal. But I think it does merit examination for a second. What is this sort of federal government lab's role in all of this, right? So, Scott alluded to this earlier, NREL, we're a scientific institution. We're independent, objective, apolitical, very technical. Because of that, it is not our mandate or our style, our philosophy really, to provide direct policy recommendations for Metro government, nor are we going to publicly advocate for any specific policies or governmental actions really in any way. That's kind of the job of everyone on this Zoom meeting, right? But that's not our role as an institution. And preserving our independence and our status as an honest broker of unbiased information, it's just something that we take really, really seriously. But so disclaimers aside about what we won't do, what we absolutely will do very enthusiastically is we will help you identify all of the options that the city has available. And then beyond just identifying the options, at the peril of repeating myself, we're also going to help you evaluate them. We're going to look at the kind of practical and legal feasibility of different pathways. We're going to assess the costs and the benefits and the pros and the cons, really just so that the city can have sort of like a solid evidence base from which to make decisions from. That's really kind of the philosophy. That's the role that we see ourselves playing. So in terms of what we've actually been up to, so first off, I'll say that Allison and her team and Zach as well, they've been deeply generous with their time, and they've allowed me to pepper them with a lot of questions, many, many hours of questions, just so I can better understand the situation in the city. I've also done a bit of legal research. I've taken a good look at the LG&E relationship and sort of what they are planning and thinking about, and really just tried to wrap our heads around this whole situation in Louisville. One last thing before I get into kind of the substance of what I've found so far. So based on guidance from Allison in particular, we are going to work to make sure that environmental justice and equity are really prominent considerations that are integrated throughout this whole project. And I just want to break down for all of you how we are thinking about those concepts, at least initially, and feedback is certainly very welcome now or later. But yeah, so personally, I like to break things down into these 3 categories. The first is procedural justice. So this is the ability of people to have a voice in the framing of energy problems and then the policies and approaches to addressing those problems. So putting that into practice for y'all, we want to be asking along the way in this project, are the people who are going to be negatively or even positively impacted by the city's decisions around this 2030 goal, are they being meaningfully involved in the decision process? I think that that's kind of a really fundamental pillar of kind of environmental and energy justice. So the next is recognition justice. This is basically an understanding of the kind of historical and I suppose also present causes of social inequities in the city, and then the acknowledgement of marginalized and disadvantaged communities in relation to the energy system in the city. So essentially, making sure that historical injustices around the energy system, things like running a transmission line or a power plant in the middle of a low-income community, right? That these things are acknowledged and accounted for in a real and meaningful way in the city's energy policy decision-making. Finally, distributional justice. So this is like the fair and equitable distribution of energy system benefits and burdens across the city, right? So here, we kind of, one way to think about it, we have to wrap our heads around the idea that when we pursue and think about all of these different actions to get to 2030 and beyond, to the 2035 and the 2040 goals, those actions, they're going to have costs, they're going to have benefits. And we want to make sure that those costs and benefits are spread in an appropriate way across the community, while accounting for the historical injustices and the current priorities of the community. So, so I think I'll stop there because that's kind of a bit, but that's kind of how we're thinking about these different things. Okay, I do see a comment from Paul on LG&E. I promise to read that in full in a little bit, but I will absolutely be speaking about LG&E because they are certainly the elephant in the room in terms of the supply side of things. So we can just make sure to talk a bit about that. So time to get into substance. We're done with all the context. So basically, as background, when we're thinking about this 2030 goal for 100% renewable energy for municipal operations, there's two sides of the equation. So there's supply, right? Where do we get our electricity from? We want that to be 100% renewable in 9 years. And then there's demand, right? Demand is the city's electricity usage, which reflects how much renewable electricity the city is going to have to go out and procure in order to meet the 2030 goal. And I think what I can tell you is this, reducing your demand for electricity, it is not the 2030 municipal goal directly, but it will be instrumental in the city actually achieving the goal if they want to do it in the most cost-effective manner. We know this. We know this from working with so many utilities and cities and states over the years that it is usually significantly cheaper and faster to meet these kinds of clean energy goals by driving down demand for electricity and then procuring clean energy for whatever's left. I think it's important to know that there's kind of a portfolio approach here. We aren't just going to be looking myopically at just the supply side of things because it'll end up being more expensive. Let's dive into the demand side here. So when I say demand side or demand side measures, I'm talking about a few things. So first, I'm talking about conservation. So this is basically making behavioral changes to use less energy. That's either by like one of us walking around and turning off the lights or turning down the aircon, or it's through an automated control system that maybe does that for us, right? So that's conservation. The second is energy efficiency. So here, we're talking about saving energy by replacing less efficient appliances with more efficient appliances, or maybe by weatherizing or otherwise kind of modernizing buildings so that they use less energy. As well, I think one important advantage to demand side measures is that generally speaking, in most cases, you don't really need the utility to be involved at all. So the city can independently pursue energy efficiency and conservation efforts without LG&E being involved, which is simply not the case on the supply side of things. We'll get into that shortly, but I think that autonomy of action around the demand side, it's just a really important characteristic and something to keep in mind. And then finally, I'll just make the point that there are a lot of different kinds of energy efficiency, from public outdoor lighting, indoor lighting, building retrofits, insulation, windows, boilers, chillers, you name it, right? Here's the thing, they all cost a different amount. and they're all, and the solution that you need changes from building to building. So, you know, in terms of what makes sense economically, we really have to look on an individual level at each of the metro government's facilities. There's kind of not like a one-size-fits-all solution there if you're trying to do things in an economic way. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this, but or to just go through this very quickly. But just so you guys know, just to make this not theoretical, you know, it's important that we at NREL believe it's important to also provide advice on actually how to finance these things, right? Because this money isn't just coming out of thin air. You know, these are, in order to make these not theoretical concepts, we have to wrap our heads around all of the different ways that we can potentially finance things. The good news is that all of the different approaches all drive down energy savings, but the question is, do you save money or not? And that depends essentially on the role of kind of the private sector, whether it's banking or, you know, private energy service companies and what their role is versus just paying for it all yourself. So in terms of, you know, what I've actually identified on the demand side, I will just walk through this before we get into sort of the more delicate or thorny issues around the supply side. So first, in terms of measures to ensure less electricity is consumed, the first and the cheapest option is going to be to take buildings that you own that have existing control systems that aren't being utilized or maybe not being super well utilized, and just implement strategies to do common sense things, like turning off the lights at night or turning down the aircon when no one's in the building, right? So that's very low hanging fruit. The next approach is to actually invest in those control systems for buildings, but we just want to make sure if we do that, that we're only doing it for buildings that we know are going to be around for a while. If we're going to, you know, do a big capital project to get built, you know, energy controls in, and then we retire the building 10 years later, maybe that may or may not actually make sense. Next, there appears to be some pretty low-hanging fruit around kind of municipal public lighting, and to change those things from conventional technologies that are 20 years old to LEDs. And I know that the city is definitely in a sort of a negotiation period right now about how exactly to do that. Also, a variety of opportunities to kind of weatherize buildings, swap out appliances for space and water heating, change out lighting, things like that. We also do have some options worth exploring for Metro government to generate its own clean energy on site, namely through rooftop solar for electricity, and then possibly, this is something we have to look into in a little more detail, switching the heating and cooling in some of the systems to something that's called a water source heat pump. So Louisville has a big water table under it that's not necessarily common for large cities. And it makes it really easy to sort of use that water table as a heat sink to do heating and cooling that is carbon free and very close to free in cost. So that's just something to mention there. However, rooftop solar, one thing to mention, very common model in the US for solar, it's called leasing, so solar leasing. A private installer, they actually own the system, and then they bring the capital, they sort of build it, they make it happen. And then they lease it to the customer. It's called third-party ownership, third-party solar. These are things that we call it. It's a great way to help clean up the electricity supply without making any large upfront capital expenditures. But unfortunately, it is illegal in the state of Kentucky, which means that any rooftop solar that the city chooses to deploy, it has to provide that CapEx upfront, or it has to get a bank loan to do that. Another piece just to mention, the rate at which LG&E solar customers are compensated if they have excess electricity and push it out to the grid, that rate is currently being reviewed by the Kentucky Public Service Commission. So once we have a little bit more information on that, it's going to have likely some serious implications for what makes economic sense versus not for the city, and frankly for the whole community. So just two more slides. We're just going to talk about the supply side here. So, you know, the supply side is, I sort of said this already, this is where you're actually getting your electricity from in bulk, right? Wholesale electricity. And I'm sure you guys know that the Metro government and everyone in Louisville purchases electricity at a regulated retail rate from your monopoly vertically integrated utility, LG&E. So LG&E is currently 97% fossil fueled. Their parent company, PPL, has committed to reducing carbon emissions from their utility business, I think 70% by 2040, 80% by 2050. So I hope I'm not saying anything controversial here, but these objectives, as stated by PPL, so they're not aligned necessarily with the city's stated policy targets. So that's one thing worth mentioning. And then also, those objectives do not appear to have made their way into any of LG&E's publicly available infrastructure investment plans, at least not that I've been able to find. So just think that's important to mention as well. So for additional context, any investor-owned vertically integrated utility in the US, LG&E, there's many others, they are subject to state regulatory oversight on things like anything that they want to invest in, the fuel contracts and the power purchase agreements that they purchase, how much they charge customers for electricity, things like that. And so because of just the sort of wonky details of how LG&E is regulated by the commission in Frankfurt, and what some of the state statutes say, there's a few things that I feel like they're very important to share that I sort of have found in my research that I said, okay, this is important and is sort of influential in terms of what the pathways are. So first, no matter how cheap solar is compared to the power plants that LG&E currently owns and operates, if LG&E purchases solar capacity to serve a particular client, like if the city decided to opt into LG&E's green tariff program, that client, so in that case, the city, they will be charged an additional fee on top of their normal energy charge, which means under the current paradigm, that the city is operating in, which is determined by state policy, getting solar directly from LG&E will always cost more money. It's not because solar isn't cheap. It's just because of how rate making and utility monopoly regulation in Kentucky and many other states work, at least, today. So that's one. Two, it is my current, at least initial understanding, again, under the way things work in Kentucky, from like a legal and regulatory standpoint, that the city cannot simply sign a power purchase agreement with a private solar developer to decarbonize. It's just not a viable pathway. We can get into the details of this, but my understanding is that this is just not institutionally or legally possible, and LG&E is not under any obligation to enable that type of arrangement to occur. So another piece of context. Last, this is a bit wonky, but it is important for context just to understand the water that you guys are all swimming in here a little bit. Investor-owned utilities like LG&E, they are regulated in a way that they tend to favor making big capital expenditures. So things like building a new transmission line or a new power plant, and they tend to favor that over doing what are called operational expenditures. So that's like paying for a fuel contract or paying a solar developer a monthly payment for the energy they produce. This is because traditional regulatory approaches, like what you have in Kentucky, they tend to reward IOUs, what's called a return on equity, an ROE, for any capital expenditure that they make. Whereas those operational expenditures, like the solar PPA, they just get passed right through to customers without a profit being taken. So because of this, and I don't really have a position on if this is right or wrong or good or bad. That's not really my role, but I did want to flag it for everyone. LG&E likely has a business incentive to directly own as much solar and wind energy as possible, as opposed to maybe an alternative of going out to the market and signing contracts with private developers, which is, by the way, that's the type of arrangement that about 80% of the US renewable energy capacity is under. So just another piece of institutional context, which will make the options that I'm about to show you on my last slide, it'll make a little more sense about why some things are there and some things are not. I guess, in sort of the uniquely, I might use the word constrained environment that the city is operating in terms of trying its supply side options. What do we have at our disposal? What can the city actually do to decarbonize over the next 9 years? And if we take a look at this graph, the options as they move from left to right, they sort of shift from having LG&E fully 100% involved in supplying that electricity all the way to the right-hand side where they are not involved in supplying electricity at all. So I'm going to start on the left and just move my way over. So LG&E has 2 renewable energy programs that I was able to identify. The Green Tariff, which is essentially something that I described earlier, where a customer can opt into this, but they have to pay an energy charge that is incremental. It's above and beyond the normal regulated energy charge. So it's always going to be more expensive, and that's just kind of the way that it's structured in the regulatory paradigm. And then the Solar Shares program is sort of a version of that is more oriented towards rooftop solar. But that's with LG&E completely 100% involved. Then we have this thing that's called a virtual power purchase agreement. We could probably do a 2-hour webinar just on this single topic, but a VPPA is essentially a financial transaction that supports the development of renewable energy somewhere in the region. And then it yields the city renewable energy certificates, often at 0 or close to 0 net cost. It just depends on the terms of the individual deal. And then I think what's important here with the VPPA is that renewable electricity would not be physically delivered to the city. It's still a way for the city to support renewable energy development, in a measurable and trackable way, but some of the co-benefits around air quality, health impacts, things like that, they just aren't there because the project is hundreds of miles away. So that's another one. So in my last slide, I talked about kind of your regulatory paradigm, some of the legal constraints that the city has, that customers generally in Kentucky have. This is outside the scope of anything NREL is going to be doing because we don't do advocacy activities, but the city certainly, as many cities across the US have done, can consider doing certain advocacy activities to try and change state law and things like that, because those can sometimes be important and help move the needle in terms of pushing forward on decarbonization. The next is basically a partial municipalization. So the idea here would be that the city would essentially figure out, in collaboration with LG&E, if they are willing to sort of entertain the idea of reclaiming the distribution network that serves the municipality, but not the rest of the community. And then basically taking steps to start a municipal electric utility that just serves the city, and then going out and getting supply from the Midwest ISO and private renewable energy developers and decarbonizing like that in a fairly quick manner, and potentially doing that as well in collaboration with other large loads large sources of demand in the area, like the public school system, the university system, things like that. And then last, we have full municipalization. So the idea here, many cities have gone through this process. It can take a long time, a lot of legal bills. It can become pretty politically contentious at times, but it's also very much possible. Is to basically take control of the entire distribution network for electricity in the city and start a municipal electric utility. At this point, the city would have full control over supply for the entire area. The city would have control over the rates that customers are charged, how solar is compensated, what kind of energy efficiency sort of programs are offered, everything. If they could, so that would be a lot of control for the community. But it also is a hard path to get there. So with that, I'm done with formal remarks, and it seems like there's no less than 8 questions in the chat. I'm not sure if Allison, do you want to flag a few for me, or should I go through them myself? How do you want to do it?
Sure, I'll go ahead and read those out to you. We have a question from Wallace about the part where you'll be evaluating the potential for solar installations on Louisville Metro buildings. He asked if there is a timeline on when we can expect that particular piece.
So we have not started contracting yet for phase 2. So I think we will have a better answer of, about kind of the timeline for the whole project at that point. Certainly, Wallace, one of the things that we are going to be looking at is the potential for rooftop solar on municipal buildings. The issue is every building is a custom job. So we're going to have to come up with some, we could spend the entire contract funding just kind of doing detailed modeling of each building in the city. We're not going to do that because of all the other options that we have to look at. So the question is, can we gather enough data through, working with Zach, who's been doing a great job kind of collecting a lot of data to see if we can sort of identify the lower hanging fruit places where we think, this could actually make a really big dent, and then do some simulation and modeling for those buildings to do that. The other piece is, in my opinion, there's not really, until we hear from the Kentucky Public Service Commission about that rooftop solar compensation rate, it doesn't necessarily make sense to spend a lot of energy looking at the economics, because the rules might change overnight. So likely what we're going to end up doing is setting up the analysis, waiting for the Service Commission. Once they come back with a number for compensation, we'll plug that in and then start generating results. So I wish I had a more concrete timeline around that deliverable to tell you about, but check back in a couple months, and I think I might have a different answer for you.
Thanks, Owen. Next question. So this is a hypothetical. If everyone changed their heating, cooking, hot water, and dryers to electric, how would this change the equation?
Great question. Very, very good question. So ultimately, from a carbon standpoint, it would probably, if LG&E didn't do anything differently at all, if they still had 97% fossil fuel in 10 years from now, it would still probably be better on a carbon front. So certainly load would go up, the demand for electricity would go up quite significantly, but it essentially, this electrification thing, this is the most viable pathway that we have right now to decarbonizing our entire economy. So it's something that I would welcome. I think the question also is, when we do electrify these things, like our hot water heater, or our dryers, things like that, are there ways to do it intelligently, right? So where we basically make sure that they're running at times of day where renewable energy is plentiful, and not running at times of day when they're not. I also see Scott just popped up in your video. Scott, were you going to say something?
Yeah, just comparison from LA for that question, where we did look at this, different scenarios of electrification, because you can never tell really what people will do. You might have the policies, the costs become an issue with the drivers. So in 2045, we had looked at moderate electrification and high electrification scenarios. And the difference there was about 800 megawatts higher load under that high electrification. So you'd have to build 800 megawatts more renewables for Los Angeles, which has a very high thing to start with. So right now they're at 6. By 2045, under moderate electrification, they need 7.8 gigawatts. And under high electrification, they need 8.6 gigawatts to get to that. So there's this trade-off, right? You do reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Utilities typically like electrification because they're selling more electrons. So there's that kind of tension there that Owen talked about between LG&E, where, hey, we're going to be selling more kilowatt hours. They should be green kilowatt hours. Things.
I should also say there's kind of there's a saying in the utility industry that growth pays for growth. So, what that means in this context is, if we did electrify everything, there would be a huge amount more money floating through the system, which would make it easier to finance the more renewable energy projects that we need. At the same time, you just need a lot more.
Yeah.
And then just one more number, the question I had about the role of efficiency and demand response. So under that same scenario there in 2045, if you didn't have aggressive efficiency and demand response, you would need 10.1 gigawatts to meet that kind of increased load. So, right, the load would go up, but you wouldn't have those. So you'd have to build more and more renewables to meet that.
Great, thank you both. Owen, this is one that you saw and I think touched on, but I just want to see if there's anything to add. The elephant in the room is LG&E, owned by PPL. Is LG&E a partner in the goal and study? If LG&E is reticent to change, is municipalization being considered? As long as LG&E is burning coal, municipalization must be considered. That's doable, but could take 10 years to accomplish. So I want to add 2 things here real quickly, just for local context. Some of you may remember in recent memory, we municipalized our water company. So there is precedent for that in Louisville. And to Owen's point about having a lot more flexibility, municipal utilities do not answer to the PSC. So they do not have to follow the same rules as, for example, a regulated utility, which means we can set our own rates and that sort of thing. Owen, did you have anything to add, or Scott?
So from my side, I mean, the question is, there's a few parts to the question, which is LG&E a partner in the goal and study? So in the goal, I'm going to put that back to Allison about, maybe the status of discussions with LG&E as being a partner in the goal. But what I can say about the study is, for the moment, because we're still in phase one where we're just kind of investigating things, I personally have not spoken to LG&E, but absolutely plan to speak to multiple departments of LG&E as soon as the second phase takes off to let them know about this and to sort of feel out their level of interest in sort of playing ball in all of this. Obviously, municipalization is a sensitive subject, especially for them. It is being considered in this study. It's on the table. I think that we have to sort of, as NREL, need to wrap our heads around how exactly we're going to sort of provide unbiased information on such a thorny political issue. But it is something that we're kind of talking actively about internally, and we can certainly take a look at it. And I think all options should be on the table at an early stage. There's no reason to sort of systematically eliminate things without at least having an initial look at them. And I also agree that it could take 10 years to accomplish. That's generally about the time frame. So that's noted.
And I will say, as far as LG&E support of our goal, they have been very open. Our office has been meeting with them since mid-2019, every other month, to talk about our options and how, they were there when we passed that goal. They spoke to Metro Council about that. The people that we work with at LG&E are very anxious to help us do that. But again, they are in a regulatory environment. So while, the parent company PPL, their goals are in line with ours, LG&E still operates under state regulation. And so that's what makes it complicated for them to support our goals. But they have been working with us and working through every option that they have to help us meet that. So they have been very supportive. A comment from Margaret, even if we depend on fossil fuel-free electric power, if more of us switch to electric vehicles, space heating and cooling, water heating, etc., that will likely increase demand, at least in the early phases of the work, which pretty much, just what Owen said. Let's see, from Steve, will your study identify what impacts reaching the goals have on pollution?
Great question. I think that's to be determined. I think that we do want to have some additional conversations with the community once we get through the contracting period. The reality is, this LA. So, for instance, this LA 100 study was a massive 3-year, $10 million effort where we were able to basically look at every single aspect possible. For Louisville, because of the size of our budget, we are going to have to do a little bit of prioritization, and that prioritization is going to try to reflect community priorities. So I think it's a great question to raise, and I think that we'll have ample opportunity to sort of do some of that prioritization, because the study certainly can't look at everything, and we need to figure out what the most important thing is as a community with a finite amount of resources.
Right. From George, why does municipal rooftop solar not appear on your supply side spectrum?
Yeah, that's a good question. Rooftop solar, as seen by a utility, is mostly a demand reduction. So oftentimes in the utility industry, we talk about rooftop solar as a demand side measure, even though it is technically generating electricity. Most of the time with rooftop solar, it's being generated at what we call quote unquote behind the meter. That's the industry term. So it is seen as demand reduction, and therefore it's a demand side measure. We could just as easily put it on the supply side, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The important thing is that we're going to be looking at it. But yeah, kind of how we categorize it. Some industry people say it's supply, some people say it's demand, some people say it's both.
A great question from Margaret. If we get electricity from companies other than LG&E, does LG&E still own the power distribution network?
A trick question, I see, because you actually are not able to get any electricity from any other company besides LG&E. So if somehow that was legal and allowed, LG&E at this current point in time would still own the distribution network. And the distribution network, if you're not kind of a power engineer person, that's the local poles and wires. That's not like the big high voltage stuff that goes over the highway or anything like that. That's kind of the in-city stuff that's used to deliver and retail electricity. So yeah, LG&E owns that unless there was a process to municipalize, they will continue to own that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or if I could add, just if there are other models that evolve. So if you look in different places across the country where, say, Texas, where it's become deregulated, right? So there's companies that own the generation, then companies own the wires, and then there are people who kind of bill the customers. California's got similar things through kind of clean choice, the community choice aggregators, where the local utility owns the distribution, but then you can buy from that local CCA. We had a call with Pittsburgh and their utility, Duquesne Power and Light, a couple of weeks ago. Very similar. They own essentially the wires and the meters and the billing, but then they purchase power kind of on the bulk market and don't really own the generation. And then one last example that I thought was really interesting is in Cleveland. They do have an IOU, but then they've also got Cleveland Power and Light. And I think they've actually built a duplicate distribution system. So you could have two sets of wires going through the city, which seems pretty inefficient to me. But I understand that's the situation they have in Cleveland based on my conversation with folks there.
Great. Mark,
great comment.
Oh, I'm sorry, Owen, go ahead.
I was just going to add on, yeah, so I mean, generally the situations that Scott mentioned in terms of, it's called retail choice, community choice aggregation, things like that, great, exciting things that are completely illegal in Kentucky, at least for now. So that's kind of like that advocacy bucket of activities that we're not going to be involved in, but certainly, you know, the city staff knows about that and may decide to do something about that, as might some of you. So yeah, just wanted to flag that. And then, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Allison.
Sure. Mark, I'm going to skip your question because and I'll come back to it, I promise. But Wallace asks, while we're on this topic, would you discuss the pluses and minuses of connecting Metro Louisville to the MISO market?
Sure. So
MISO,
connecting, MISO, yeah. So guys, for those of you that don't know MISO, that's the Midwest Independent System Operator. That's a competitive wholesale electricity market that where people sort of buy and sell power across the Midwest. Y'all are, I think, 4 miles from connecting to it, something like that. So you'd have to build a short transmission line to do that. But you know, basically connecting to the Midwest ISO. The issue is you can't, at the moment, it's not something that you could do unless you did a bunch of other stuff, right? So it's not a single action that you could take. If you did that, you would have an illegal transmission line that would, you know, not be able to basically serve anyone through LG&E's network, right? So connecting to the Midwest ISO is something that would happen either through convincing LG&E to do it, through advocacy activities. They were in it years ago and left it, and I'm sure they had a good reason for that, likely related to their sort of business model and the sort of profit incentives that they're given by the state. Or you could municipalize. And if you either partially or fully municipalize, then the question is, you know, like, how would you get your power? And almost certainly you would build that transmission line and you'd get that power from MISO. That would give you the ability to sign bilateral contracts with renewable energy power producers all over the East Coast, and including in the MISO market. You could also buy what's called market power, which is basically power that it's electricity, energy specifically, that changes in price on, I believe, a half-hourly basis based on all sorts of supply and demand things. So you'd have the ability to buy market power and then also contract renewable energy. I will say, you know, so with LG&E, if you look at a kind of a standard bill that they offer you, they detail out everything that they're providing you. They say this is how much energy costs, this is how much transmission costs, distribution, administration, metering, all these things, right? So if you look just at that energy charge, and then you compare it to the prices that are available in the Midwest ISO, the Midwest ISO is 2 to 3 times cheaper for that energy component of the bill. So in theory, there could be a cost savings associated with doing this, but that is very theoretical and not something that I have looked at in any real detail yet, only a very cursory glance.
Great, thank you, Owen. Question from Mark. I've seen notice in the news recently about a plant in South Dakota that makes wind turbine blades closing down, work moving maybe to China. How do situations like these influence the long-term viability of renewable energy efforts?
That's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily read into that single plant closure. You know, a plant can close for any number of reasons that may or may not be fully related to kind of the market in that region. Certainly, there's not a ton of, so wind turbines are very expensive to transport. They're tough and difficult and expensive to transport. And if they built a wind turbine manufacturing facility in South Dakota, it's possible that the markets around that area where they might be delivering, just there isn't necessarily enough demand. What I would say generally is that demand for renewable energy is booming. I mean, 90-something% of the new capacity that we add every year is wind and solar. So certainly we are moving in the direction of more manufacturing, you know, on a net basis coming here. And then depending on what shakes out with this infrastructure bill. So right now, if the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan one, in its current form passes, it is starting a national transmission authority, which is basically a government agency that is going to make it much easier to build transmission. And if you ask any renewable energy developer what the main issue is and why their job is hard and why it's really hard for them to develop projects, it's because all the transmission is full. And transmission takes 12 years to build and to get through permitting and siting. So if we can accelerate that, there's going to be a huge market pull because of that policy push. So I'm assuming this bill passes, I'm pretty bullish on it. And then frankly, if this reconciliation bill passes, we're going to be off to the races. Yeah.
And I'll add that this also plays into our goal of building a green economy. So it is not just about addressing climate change. It's about building an economy of the future to support the renewable energy demand. So we feel like that has to be an important component as we explore this. What are not just the economic benefits, but the employment opportunities that this could bring to residents, not just of Louisville, but of Eastern and Western Kentucky that we know have been decimated as the shift from coal has taken place.
Yeah, and I would just say another sort of platitude or saying that's really floating around the energy industry right now. Everyone's talking about equity and everyone's talking about job creation. The saying is efficiency is equity. So essentially efficiency, if you guys begin to invest in a big way in energy efficiency in your community through various policies and programs and efforts, you can be very thoughtful about who you employ, if that's within your ability to sort of do that, and you can really keep that economic growth opportunity, those job opportunities within the city, and potentially even prioritizing certain more highly impacted communities, things like that. So efficiency is equity. There's a huge opportunity to kind of decarbonize, make your job easier to get to that 2030 goal, create a bunch of jobs, and really hit those kind of equity and environmental justice goals as well.
So I told you, Owen, that they would have fantastic questions, and I was not disappointed.
Yeah, these are wonderful questions. Thank you.
Very thoughtful. I don't see any more in the chat box. So if anyone has any final questions, please put those in now. Scott, did you want to give us any last words before you or Owen, before we turn it back over to Julia?
Just one on that topic of the wind turbine plants. Just keep in mind that technology is evolving every day, right? So there are new wind turbine technologies coming to market very soon that are going to allow access to taller hub heights. So areas that were previously kind of thought of as not good wind resource areas, the Southeast in particular, I'm not sure about the map for Kentucky. All of a sudden, when you start getting these new technologies where you can do potentially self-erecting towers and more efficient turbines, you begin to open up other areas. So those are US companies that are developing those technologies. We're also looking at some wacky things like, 3D printing of wind blades on site and different components there. So That's changing all the time. Same with PV, right? The efficiencies are getting better all the time. There are US manufacturers who are competitive globally. There are Chinese manufacturers who are doing business here. So it is a global market, but those technologies are evolving all the time, and especially for storage as well.
And I think we have a lot of that we can thank NREL for some of those advances. We do have another question from Amanda. Do we need municipalization to meet other overlapping resiliency goals, such as if we power our water pumping by renewables, our water may not go out when the power does?
Great question. So the short answer is no. That is absolutely something that I suspect if the city or if community members brought to LG&E, they would be very happy to build something for you and to charge you for it. The issue is, you know, what are they going to charge you? Is it going to be appropriate for what you need? And I think I guess what I'll say is municipalization gives you more control over the cost, right? So when you're working with a monopoly utility, you know, I don't want to like portray these businesses as being evil or anything. This is just kind of the way things work. Is you go to them, you tell them you need something, they give you a price, and that's the price. That's kind of how it goes. So and they also do have good expertise in terms of designing, you know, battery and PV solutions, and you know, they have great engineers on staff. So I don't mean to sort of favor one versus the other. So municipalization is not needed to meet those resiliency goals. I would say in my estimation, the hardest thing about resiliency goals is articulating them and actually saying, you know, this is what we need and this is how much we're really willing to pay for it. Because if resiliency costs money, and there's a big climate investment resilience gap right now. Some people say it's $500 billion in the US. So definitely big gap of cash going into a very important topic.
Great. I don't see any more questions. I want to thank Owen and Scott so much.
I think Sam Avery had a question. Sorry to interrupt you, Allison.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He had a question, and he's on screen. So go ahead.
Oh,
Sam.
yes.
Yeah, sorry to come in so late at this point, but I wanted to say that I'm a former solar installer and a member of the Renewable Energy Alliance of Louisville. And the reason, when we were working on what the terms of this resolution would be with members of the Parks and Sustainability Committee, we purposely made it so that the first goal or two would be easily accomplished as with the current legal and technological environment which we had available to us. And the third, the community-wide, is something that's we really don't know how we're going to do that. But just I would like some sense from you, since you stated that for a much larger city like Los Angeles, that they could do 70 to 90% of their renewable energy demand through solar and wind. And I calculated myself that to do the phase one, that is the 100% renewable electricity for city government in Louisville, it would take about 400 acres of solar, more or less, maybe 500, maybe a little less. It's hard to say. And that is about 1% of the total community demand for electricity, the city government is. So that we would need something 100 times larger than that to do, to make Louisville 100% renewable. And I'm wondering, are my calculations way off? Are we going to be able, or are we going to be able to conserve that much electricity? Or are we going to end up with 40,000 acres of solar panels in order to accomplish this? So maybe we need to talk about this, but I just want to sense you guys who've done this before. How practical is it in terms of just sheer space to achieve 100% renewable energy?
So I don't doubt that your calculations are, you know, I'd have to look into them in detail, but I don't doubt that they're in the realm of probably accurate. The issue is there's a few things to sort of touch on here. So one, it's how you define the goal, right? So if all you want is a system that on an annual basis covers the, you know, produces enough energy to meet the government's goal, you can do that, right? But what we're sort of, what this LA study did, for instance, is it's looking at 24/7 electricity. So it's not just looking at, netting things out over on an annual basis and saying that's approximately right, but the reality is there's when it's not sunny at night, where is that power coming from, right? That power is probably still coming from the coal plant or the gas plant. So there's kind of that definitional question around how you actually define the goal. So I think that's important. Like, are we talking about annual average kind of usage? Or are we talking about 24/7 power? And then I'm trying to think, beyond that, I mean, I think it's not so much, this is just my take from looking at things initially. To me, the challenge is not about the scale of the amount of energy. I mean, you could procure 40, 50, 60 megawatts of solar anywhere. There's a really good, well-developed market for it. It's the feasibility. It's the institutional barriers. It's, is LG&E going to allow this to happen? What do the state statutes say about can you actually sign a PPA? And my initial read is you just can't sign a PPA. It's not
Right.
legal. It's not sort of allowed. So that to me is more of the challenge than going out to a very well-developed solar utility scale solar market and saying, hi, we need 40 megawatts. Give us your offers, because you'll get a great offer. It'll get built in a year and a half. You'll be very happy. The issue is just, getting to a point institutionally, legally, from a regulatory standpoint, where you can actually make that happen.
But were you able to if you were able to get through the legal hurdles, you would still need an enormous amount of land to produce that much energy with our current technology. So I'm just wondering, for my own thinking about this, are we looking at something that we could do with current technology, or do we have to do something totally different?
Well, for example, if those wind turbine technologies I talked about, if you can start getting into some of those higher hub heights and areas that were thought previously to be not developed, that changes the game. That work and those maps should be published. They may even be published already. It was kind of any day now type of thing that was done for DOE. The other thing with LA is, they're a much better solar climate than you all are, right? They're in the desert and they've got great solar insolation and great resource, but they've also got access to some really good wind resources up in Wyoming that they could potentially pull down. And then geothermal was another big piece of that. So they're able to pull those different technologies to dispatch at different times. So only one scenario had the offsets of natural gas, but some of those, the early no biofuel made aggressive use of rooftop solar, just community solar, utility solar, plus wind, plus hydro, a 1,200 megawatt pump storage hydro plant, Castaic. So they're able to dispatch that, and then a ton of solar and hydrogen, right? So it was kind of an all of above renewable strategy. And communities are limited by the resources in your area. So maybe there's some run of river type technologies or some small like hydro that could potentially be looked at, biofuels, landfill gas. I think we need to really be broadly thinking about it. Biomass itself, I don't know if there's any biomass power plants. There are discussions about biomass. Some of the advisory group members didn't want any emissions, so they didn't want building wood-fired power plants. Other people were all in favor of it because you do have that dispatchability with those. So there's trade-offs for everything. You cover a bunch of land, or do you look for some other resources?
Okay. Well, it's good. It's good to see we can do this. That's the main thing.
Yeah, I don't think that the amount of land that we're talking about here, if it were to be 100% solar, is an insurmountable quantity of land to find, provided that you're connected to the Midwest ISO network and you have sort of the whole region and area to find space for.
Okay. Thank you.
And then that other, the transmission potential, that's another huge potential game changer. NREL, if you're interested, just a few weeks ago, they called the SEAM study, interconnection SEAM study, where we looked at very large transmission connections across the different, kind of like the Eastern interconnect, the Western interconnect, and significant potential savings were there if you can build something like that, kind of an interstate highway system for transmission and wheel power from the Southwest and the Dakotas to places where it's needed. And who knows, 20 years from now, that may be a reality. Someone says, I'm ready.
Sorry, fire truck went by. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Sam, for that final question. These were fantastic questions. I hope we do this again sometime soon as the project develops, and we will certainly keep this group informed of that work. So I'll turn it back over to Julia for our final plugs for upcoming LSC events.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you Scott, Owen, and Allison. This was very informative and some great discussion, and I'm sure the discussion will not end here. I'm going to pop our Facebook into the chat. Like I said at the beginning, this is the best way to stay up to date on all the things that LSC is working on and upcoming events, such as our green drinks happening the third Wednesday of each month. So our upcoming green drinks is in July, I believe July 21st. Also save the date, November 10th is Louisville Sustainability Council's annual sustainability summit. And it'll be called Powering the Movement. And we're focusing on how community building and climate change go hand in hand. So you won't want to miss it. So be sure to mark that down, November 10th. Thank you again for everyone for being here, our amazing speakers. This was recorded. It will get sent out to all the attendees tomorrow. It will also be on our website if you want to check back. So we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks everyone for being here.
Bye, everybody. Hope to see you in person soon.
Yes, us too. Maybe one of these we can join in person and we'll actually be there in the room with y'all.
That would be fantastic. We look forward to it.
Yeah, especially the green drinks part, you know, some of that famous bourbon and whiskey.
Right.
We'll have a cold one waiting for you, Scott.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.